first, just kind of big picture, just a bit about myself and how I approach some of this research. So kind of my research philosophy is maintaining working landscapes while ensuring healthy ecosystems. So I grew up in a rural part of eastern Washington. My parents are both teachers, but I grew up on a 5-acre alfalfa farm, so I really appreciated the agriculture aspect of what land can produce and the jobs that they'll support. But as well, I grew up hiking, fishing, hunting, doing all that, and I really enjoy that. So it's for me, it's key that we can ensure healthy ecosystems going forward into the future. So a bit of context, which actually most of you know this way better than most of the people I talk with. So, but I'll give you the same spiel. So as part of that, our IGER started in August of 2011. We were putting interdisciplinary teams, and I was in the sagebrush step team. So we had a restoration ecologist, wildlife biologist, and then a rural sociologist. And we, so we're kind of tasked with, addressing some challenges with sagebrush steppe. But what was really cool is they actually sent us on a field tour at the start of our program. Like we were together for a week, maybe as an entire group, and then they sent us out to kind of talk with stakeholders. So we did a field tour through all of southern Idaho. We were in, Tim was on part of it. We were in, the Oahes, went to Twin Falls, Idaho Falls, Pocatello, all over the place. Actually, no, JD was the Hefe with us. Let us. We had a lot of good baking with those Dutch ovens. Yeah, yeah, fun trip. But the thing that was, I kept saying I'm the water guy, and what are the water issues you're concerned about with sagebrush, and juniper encroachment was this theme that came up. So that's kind of where we decided to focus on. And just to kind of give some background for this issue of juniper encroachment. So here's a picture in the Oahes at Flint Creek. This is a picture around the turn of last century. You can see it's mostly open rangeland, and you got some of the juniper on the rocky outcroppings. But you can see 2010, it's pretty much a different landscape. It's pretty much a juniper forest at that point. So juniper have encroached throughout. So it's definitely likely this will impact water processes. As a side note, Mike McGee was actually at my last talk, and he said I think he said he took this picture. So he was like, hey, I took that. So yeah. I haven't known who it was. So anyway, so yeah, having a huge impact across much of the arid west. And then, as we were talking about, Tim, myself, and our community were talking about how is juniper encroachment going to impact sagebrush. We're also thinking about climate change and how that's going to impact water processes. So here's a graph that some of you may have seen. This is looking at Reynolds Creek, and they started measurements around, I think 1958 or 59. And this is just observations, what they observed those first 10 years of measurements. And this is the outlet, this is the bottom of the watershed, this is the top of the watershed. And you can see at the bottom of the watershed it was rain dominated, but most of the the upper part of the watershed was snow dominated. So most of the precip that came down was snow. But they still are doing measurements. And again, I kind of like to emphasize, this isn't model results, this is just what they've observed. And you can see 2006, it's pretty much mostly rain dominated, except the upper part of the watershed is snow dominated. So we're already seeing these shifts from snow to rain in much of the sagebrush steppes. So we want to ask questions about, okay, we have this juniper encroachment process and climate change, so how do those processes interact? And then a final piece and kind of a moment that kind of crystallized kind of the research question I was looking at was we did workshops as part of our IGER teamwork. And in one of the workshops, it wasn't this one, but one of them, one stakeholder stood up and said, juniper have a huge impact on water. They take all the water out of the soil, and water is life here in the desert. And then right after that, another stakeholder stood up and said, there is no evidence that juniper impacts stream flow. And so there was this kind of, and they, afterwards they both came up to me because they knew I was a water person. They kind of were like, who's right? Does it have a huge impact or not? So to maybe self-assess, like, what do you think, how much juniper impacts water? Maybe take 30 seconds, kind of think about, how do I think about it? And maybe just chat with your neighbor. You can, do a little share with your neighbor. Here's what I think about.
I'm sure we know a lot about that.
I came to learn. No, I just always think about interceptors. No water hardly ever makes it to the ground. So I actually think a lot of it hits the tree and evaporates off.
Oh, really?
That's what I think. Yeah, I think about it,
Yeah.
under a tree. That's
I
my
was
theory.
thinking more like
So where it's
the
coming from,
trees
you
would
can
actually
just
suck
see
up
some
more.
That's the going theory, a lot of people, the sucking theory. Well, that's why I
Hadn't
came,
thought
because
about the evaporation.
I actually put this on a test this week, so I came to get the answer to my test that they're taking today. So
What's that?
I say, my class is taking a test today, and there's, this question is on there.
Oh, wow.
And I thought,
okay.
well, I should come and make sure.
There you go, verify it, yeah.
So-
All right. Well, y'all are talking way more than most groups do. Half of the groups just kind of looked at each other, and then I found it was like, let's just take a vote, you know.
Oh,
Okay.
we're academics, we like to.
Yeah, y'all like
Yeah,
talk
no,
way more. It actually wasn't gonna have the vote because I was like, I don't want people to argue with each other, but most people were comfortable. So who agrees with the first person that Juniper would have a big impact on water processes? Who is the second one? There is no evidence that Juniper impacts stream flow.
Oh, no, well,
So
can I be
yeah,
in the
first
middle?
one, Juniper have and I'm
Okay,
saying,
I'm in the middle.
Okay.
I mean, they don't have a huge impact, but they also do affect stream flow. Can I be in the middle?
And you academics
We're going binary.
We're going binary here.
Okay.
So,
Binary.
No subtleties.
I'm more on the left then.
So to kind of keep you engaged, I'm actually not going to tell you what I told them until later in the talk after I share some more data, because this was 2 years into my PhD, so I had some thoughts on it. So later in the talk, I'll share with you what I shared with them at that point. Okay, so just the research questions we were looking at. The overarching research question was, how does Juniper encroachment impact ecosystem water processes? And then kind of within that question, looking at above ground water processes, below ground, so water in the soil and the saprolite, and then stream flow processes as well. And just to note kind of how we hydrologists approach some of these questions of land cover change and how it impacts water processes. One way we can approach this question is looking at the landscape scale. So we look at this entire catchment, and we have Juniper encroachment occurring, and how does that change the stream flow at the outlet? And the other way is if we kind of zoom in on a smaller scale, look at the individual processes that are occurring at the tree level. So how much throughfall occurs, how much infiltration occurs. And one analogy I like to use is that if you're buying a car, if you're looking at the big picture, maybe you just take it for a test drive and see how fast it goes. That's kind of, you're not really concerned about the processes under the hood, it's just the big picture, how fast it go. Whereas the zoomed in, the process level approach, maybe you pull out individual spark plugs and test those spark plugs and check the alternator. And you're kind of digging in, opening up the hood. So I'll present the above and below ground chapters are kind of this process, this scale, and then the stream flow is kind of looking at this bigger picture scale. Okay, so first above ground, the above ground work. Oops. So kind of visually how we represent kind of the question we're thinking about with this work was, you have a certain amount of precipitation, and then how much water is reaching the soil differ between juniper and sagebrush. And then on top of that, we have that question of the climate change piece. So if we have juniper encroachment occurring, and we also have the climate shifting from snow to rain, how does, which process is more important, which has a greater impact on how much water reaches the soil? So we want to kind of add that layer to this above ground piece. So the work was being done in Roans Creek Experimental Watershed, which I think most of you have actually been to. It's southwestern Idaho. We were in the upper part of the watershed there. We had about 19.2 inches. As an aside, make sure when you're talking to stakeholders have already converted from metric to standard. I tried to convert, and I was like, I think it's about 600 millimeters, and I said, I think we're about 40 inches of precip, and then they were like, I was like, what? That's a weather site? And I'm like, it must be less. And I looked it up. It was it's like 19.2 inches. So just if you're, and I do convert from metric to standard here, but just as a word to the wise.
Totally learned that.
Don't do it on the fly.
Yeah.
Same with foresters. Yeah.
So the instruments we were using were lysimeters. This is one of the main instruments, and it's basically some way of collecting precipitation through fall, and then you measure that volume per time. So we had both a below tree canopy and then just in the inner space, and there's a buried tipping bucket, so we didn't have freezing issues, and you just had a tipping bucket that counted volume per time. And we had 2 of those in our plot. And just a note about what the data this generates. So if you have a rain event, it's pretty straightforward. You have rain, some of it gets intercepted, some of it goes to throughfall, and then you have that throughfall goes to the tipping bucket, and you get a volume per time. Whereas with snow, it's a little bit trickier because you have snow, and then maybe that day it'll melt, maybe a month later, maybe longer. So we're really looking at snow melt for snow processes. So we started looking at both rain through fall and snow melt, using the term surface water input. I mean, it's not a new term, but that's just what term we use for this, just because it combines both the through fall from rain and then also the snow melt from the snow that's under the canopy. And then a kind of a metric we were using to compare trees and rain versus snow was we'd use what we call surface water input ratio. So here's an example of what this would look like. Let's say we have one rain event and we have 1 inch of surface water input below the tree, so 1 inch of through fall. And then let's say we have 2 inches out in the open, so this is just the gross precipitation in the open. And then, so the surface water input ratio, this would be 1 divided by 2, which is 0.5 or 50%. So this is a surface water input ratio of 50%. So it's how much percent of the total precip occurred became through fall. So again, the higher percentage, the more total percent result in through fall. If you had a 0%, that means no through fall occurred, basically. Okay, so we also measured snow depth per event. So we had these snow stakes. We planted, and we had a game camera that took pictures every hour. And so yeah, snow depth is just total snow accumulation from a snow event. So you basically visually say how deep the snow is. Snow event would occur, and once that was over, in the pictures we could identify how deep the snow had deposited both under the tree, you can see the snow stakes under the tree, and then in the inner space. And so we had this snow depth ratio. So we had, for an event, let's say you had 6 inches average under the tree for that one snow event. And let's say you had 4 inches in the inner space. This would be a snow depth ratio of 1.5 or 150%. So you might be thinking, wait, what is that? Like, there's more snow under the tree than in the inner space. And this actually happened, and I'll kind of talk about why that happened, but just this is kind of an example to show if it's above 100%, you actually had more snow deposited under the tree. If it was less than 100%, you had more deposited in the inner space, which is typically, 95% of the time that's what occurred. You had more snow depth in the inner space, but sometimes you got more under the tree. And once we started to see this data come in, we assumed one of the theories is that it was because of tree wells. So is there skiers? Any skiers here? A couple. Yeah, so you always got to watch out for tree wells when you're skiing, and there's like the low area next to the tree. It's a low snow, so you don't want to get sucked into that. So we observed tree wells with the Juniper as well. And so just here's, let's see, it's February 17th. And you can see that yellow band is at 50 centimeters. So in the inner space, anywhere from 30 to 40 centimeter depth. And then under the tree, you can't really see, it's kind of hidden, but the yellow band was about there. So you had anywhere from 10 centimeters to 0 centimeters under the tree. So much less snowpack underneath the tree. And so we kind of surmised maybe this is because of this that we're getting, sometimes you get more snow under the tree than in the inner space. And just to, if I was watching this talk, I'd say, well, maybe you're only getting this tree well because that, lysimeter's there and that's accelerating melt for some reason. But this picture is taken on the same day during one of the snow surveys, and you can see under this pretty small tree, there's a pretty big tree well, and you can even see kind of back behind there's tree wells for all the trees. So it was very common, especially once about late January, early February hit, so you'd have a pretty significant tree well under these trees. And a lot of this evidence, but we didn't actually go out and measure long-wave short radiation, but Tim's done a lot of work where basically these trees intercept a lot of solar radiation and emit a lot of long-wave radiation that kind of caused accelerated melt, in addition to interception. This hasn't been done with Juniper, but other, like with Doug firs and other pine trees.
So with the combination of those things, in theory, does that mean climate change will actually accelerate that? Accelerate the tree well?
Potentially.
The extent of it.
Potentially. But the climate change piece does link to this, which I'll talk about in a sec. But that's, yeah, I don't want to get too deep. I could make some, like theories or what's the word I'm looking for?
Guesses.
Kind of educated guesses, but that's kind of, I don't want to. Maybe a little bit, but I don't know. I think more the question is having snow versus rain. That's going to be, I think, a bigger impact than, is there a little bit more solar radiation coming in or a little bit warmer that, I think that's the more impact, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a couple slides. So that's a good question. Okay, so I basically scaffolded up to this first graph because this is like one of the most complex graphs probably in my dissertation, so that's why we did all that scaffolding to kind of get up to this point. So the y-axis is the surface water input ratio, which we just talked about, and the snow depth ratio. And then the x-axis is the total interspace surface water input or snow depth. So this is kind of the size of the storm. So if it's the points are over here, it's a large event. Points are over here, it's a small event. And so if you have below 100%, you're going to have more throughfall in the more precipitation than throughfall. And if it's above 100%, you're going to have more throughfall in the interspace or under the canopy than in the interspace. And then we have these diamonds are the snow depth ratio, and then the circles are surface water input. So we divide it out into snow is blue, gray is mixed, and red is rain. So we're going to first, so here's all the data, but we're going to first focus on the rain events. So look, there's no rain events above 100%, which makes sense. There's always more precipitation than throughfall. So one thing we notice is that when you have graphs like this is pretty common. So you have small events, the tree's going to intercept most of the, or all of the, these events, all the precip was intercepted, which makes sense. These are pretty small events. As you increase, that percentage increases, and it kind of plateaus out a little bit. We didn't put a, a nonlinear regression line through, but it, more or less plateaus out about, 60%. And this makes sense. There's been other studies looking at rainfall interception. But what was interesting was we started to see these points, and not just the snow depth, but even the lysimeter data. So like for an individual snow event, we see sometimes that you'd have more snow deposit, or in this is going to be throughfall or snowmelt for the lysimeter. So this was going on lysimeters and the snow depth. So we were like, what is going on here? And what we kind of hypothesized that maybe it was due to these tree wells. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But first I want to mention too, I gave a presentation, a practice one back at some retired scientists I know, and they kept being like, what is the takeaway from this graph? So I'm trying to have takeaways for each graph, which I don't know if I do for academic audience, but I'll still go over them. So the takeaway from this graph is snow surface water input and snow accumulation often is greater. Maybe not often, I actually should have edited that in the other version. I would say sometimes it's greater under the juniper canopy than in the interspace. So basically, you get times when it's snowing that you get more snow deposited under the tree, the interspace, which is again not what we expected. And so we surmise that maybe it was due to this tree well. So this is just snow depth ratio. So again, you have 100% lines here. So above this, you have more snow deposited under the tree. Below this, more snow deposited in the interspace. And this is interspace snow depth minus canopy snow depth. So this is kind of a measurement of tree well. So if you have it on the, battery go out? Do that way. There we go. So if you have 0 for this measurement, it's no difference below canopy in the interspace. And then if you have 30, you'd have the average snow depth under the tree. And again, this is before the snow event happened. So pre-event, average 30 centimeters lower under the tree than outside the tree. So kind of a measurement of how deep the tree well is. And what you can see here is that on average, the deeper the tree well, the more snow is deposited underneath the tree. And we also plotted how large the storm was, and that wasn't necessarily as big a factor. We also pieced apart one of the factors that also influenced whether you'd have more or less was if it was a windy event. So this, a lot of it's blowing snow, so there's more blowing snow that's going to be blown underneath the tree. And if it was a colder event, so it's kind of drier snowpack that could actually move around versus wet snowpack will just kind of stick down once it's deposited and not move around. So this is kind of an aspect. And I should mention the difference, I should have mentioned it last time, but basically the difference in throughfall was 55% on average for rain events and then 80% for snow events. So much more throughfall occurred for snow events on average than rain events. And so kind of the takeaway here is basically more surface water input occurs under juniper and snow than in rain. And this is kind of what I wanted to mention. So basically under climate change, when you have, if you're just looking at all things being equal, same storm size, everything, under snow, you're going to get more snow and eventually more snow melt, the more water will get under the tree than rain, where since rain doesn't blow around, you just have a certain amount fall. it's more evenly distributed.
I want to make sure I understand this. So
Sure.
there's more snow under, but that's because it blew in from outside, not because it came, I mean, you call it through fall, but it's not that it came through the leaves.
No, yeah, that's not snow. It's not through fall. It's,
Okay.
it's blown around.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
snow.
Okay.
We use the word deposited because
Okay.
it wasn't. Yeah, but still, on average, again, all things being equal, you're going to have more water gets to the base of this tree.
By
if you have
snow
rain,
than by rain. Oh,
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So kind of thinking about climate change, it's again all not thinking about like timing, phenology, that thing, but just looking at this. This is better for interspace plants, for example, like sagebrush and bunch grasses, because it's more evenly distributed with rain than snow. Again, all things being equal, that's kind of
Got it.
just
Good.
that
Thanks.
piece. Okay, and then we did some simulations, which I think if you were from the Shaw at all, I don't know if it is so. Shaw model developed by Gerald Fleshinger at USC ARS down in Boise. And we use that simultaneous heat and water model. We want to do kind of current and future climate simulations, so we use John Abotsiglu's multivariate adaptive continuous analogs. And so we use current time series and then future with RCP 8.5. And we simulated with juniper, mountain sagebrush, and low sagebrush cover. And so just going to look at a couple aspects. So first I want to talk about snow water equivalent. So this is basically if you have 2 feet of snowpack and you have like a tube of it and then you melt it down, that's going to melt down to about 8 inches or so. So that's snow water equivalent, just if you took a core and you melt it down, how much water is there. And so let's first kind of look at the solid lines, which is the more or less the current climate. So you can see mountain sagebrush, you have a greater peak snow water equivalent, almost 9 inches here, compared to juniper, which is about 6 inches. So you get almost a 50% greater peak snow water equivalent in mountain sagebrush than juniper under the current climate. However, what's interesting is you look at the future climate. So this is 2000, middle of this century, and you can see the difference is pretty minor between the mountain sagebrush and juniper peak snow water equivalent. And also the timing is much earlier as well. It's almost a couple months earlier. So basically the takeaway is that you get less snow accumulation in juniper than in sagebrush. However, in the future climate, the peak snow water equivalent is not that much different between the two tree covers, or the two vegetation covers. By the way, I didn't mention this. Feel free to ask questions anytime, and Karen.
Yeah, we're already.
Yeah, but I should have mentioned that.
Well, JD started it.
Jeez. So this is, I just kind of wanted to, instead of in graph form, kind of look at just average data across the current and the future simulations. And this is again across, so it's current and future. And then we have juniper, mountain sagebrush, and low sagebrush. And so some interesting, and this is in inches, so it's surface water input in inches. And first thing I noticed is that, or that you'll notice, is that the difference in the vegetation cover type has a bigger impact on total surface water input. So for juniper, you have about 15 inches, and then for mountain sagebrush and low sagebrush, you have over 20 inches on average. And then pretty similar difference in the future climate. Whereas if you compare across the current and future climate, you have not that much different. It's a little lower, which makes sense. If it's a little bit warmer, you're going to have a little bit more, potentially a little more evaporation, a little more transpiration, but not that much difference between the current and the future. So if we're just looking at surface water input, and that's kind of your main concern, you'd be more concerned with vegetation cover than climate change. However, if we're looking at the timing, it's going to be a different story. So this is surface water input 50% day. So that's the day that you have half of your surface water input occurring. So on an average mountain sagebrush year, about 20 inches, that would be the day that 10 inches of surface water input has occurred. To add a little more complexity, from the beginning of the water year. So that's the beginning of the water year is October 1st. So day 178, that's about April 1st. Day 132 is about February 20th. So it's the day that 50%, half the surface water inputs occurred from the beginning of the water year. So the takeaway here is that difference in vegetation type isn't all that different. Maybe 5-7 days difference between a week, but it's not that different. Same with the future climate, up to 10 days different. Not a huge difference in the timing, but if you look at current to future, very big difference. So you're looking at almost 50 days here, a little over 40 days here for mountain sagebrush. So if you're more concerned about the timing, and this kind of makes sense because you have more precip occurring as rain than as snow. You're going to have more surface water input occurring than the snow just sticking there. That's more of an issue for you. Okay, so now below ground. So this question is again, we're thinking about, okay, how much precip's occurring, and then how does that impact below ground process? So how much soil moisture is in under juniper and sagebrush, and then also looking at deeper layers, so in the saprolite and the potentially the broken up bedrock. Okay, so what we did is we installed soil moisture probes in 4 different trees at our site, and here's kind of a drawing or an image of kind of what that looks like. So basically we put a probe under the tree and in the interspace at 15 and 60 centimeters. And for this probe, it's not a great picture to show this, but basically we took the distance from the edge of the canopy to the trunk and took halfway, and that's where we put these probes. And then we took that distance, and then took that distance, and we put that as, put it at least that far away from the tree. I've had some, when I presented this, some people said, oh, I've seen juniper roots past that and lateral roots. So there's a potential influence for sure, but definitely, you know, when I dug these, hit way more juniper roots here than I did out there. So more likely influenced by bunch grasses and sagebrush that were in the inner space. And then we kind of had a subset of these. So we had 2, those blue dots are trees in our plot. This is our whole plot. And we had 2 that were in more dense juniper area. So this is kind of analogous to, if you're familiar with the juniper encroachment levels, this is more of a phase 2. So it's still has some sagebrush in the inner space, but there's higher density juniper compared to what they classify as phase 1. So phase 1 is kind of more savanna-like. It's a few trees dot the landscape, and it's much higher sagebrush. So we wanted to have 2 trees more in this open area, and then 2 trees in this more denser juniper. Okay, so so the main analysis we did is we looked at per event change in soil moisture. So you have the soil moisture level before the rain event, and we just did rain events. We didn't look at snow. So yeah, the soil moisture before the rain event, we had the event occurring, and then what's the soil moisture after? And we looked at that change at each location. So this delta is this change in soil moisture at 15 centimeters. And then that's the y-axis, and the x-axis is just total event precipitation. So it's in millimeters, you can also see in inches, so half an inch, 1 inch. So larger events are this side. And then mean event rainfall intensity was that we put a kind of an orange, yellow to blue and purple, although that wasn't as big a factor, but we still wanted to put that information in there. So for us, we had kind of our own hypothesis what was going to happen. So if you were going to theorize or guess where the increase would be greater at 15 centimeters, do you think it'd be greater under the tree or in the inner space? So kind of maybe think to yourself, where do I think per event how the increase in soil moisture would be greater? So who thinks it'd be a greater increase under the tree?
How strong is the rain event?
It's this x-axis. So you say it depends on the rain event size?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What do you think? You think it'd be?
Well, if it's a strong enough rain event that you're going to get water going to juniper, then I got to think that one through a little bit. I'm not fast enough this morning.
No, but I think that's going to be a factor for sure. Okay, so a couple people said under the tree. How about in the inner space? I assume everybody else. So that's what we thought, and you're correct-ish. So so when you first, the circles are under the canopy, the triangles are in the inner space. So when you first look at it, you're saying, oh, the triangles, they're at the top there, more increase in the inner space. And again, this is smaller events, this is larger events. And we did the statistical analysis, they weren't actually statistically different. You can see some of the events, like this event, it was a greater increase in the canopy. This event, there was a greater increase in the canopy. This one as well. So on average, there was a greater inner space increase on average in the inner space, but it wasn't statistically significant. So we're like, huh. And I'm going to revisit this. We actually pieced some data apart, and I'll show you that we realized what was going on. But before I do that, I want to show that same data at the 60 centimeters. So this is the 60 centimeter depth. So a change in soil moisture at 60 centimeters, same storm, so same x-axis and same mean rainfall intensity. So who thinks greater increase under the tree, or who thinks greater increase under the inner space at 60? So that's 2 feet down, so it's about that far below the surface. So let you think about that for a second. So who thinks greater increase under the tree? Who thinks greater increase under the inner space? So Jocelyn gets the door prize. I said that to somebody else, like I should have brought prizes or something.
Well, the day is young. You can take her out for lunch or something.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. So, well, and so the first thing we noticed that most events you didn't see an increase, right? Most, I mean, you're 2 feet down. That's going to take a lot of rain to get, down to 2 feet. But when it did occur, you did see an increase at 60 centimeters. It was almost exclusively under the canopy. You had this event. You had, you can see there's a circle behind that. So a similar increase in the canopy in the inner space. And then you had this event, you had one of the inner spaces increase, but by and large, it was almost exclusively, when it happened, it was under the canopy. And so what we theorized that was going on is that maybe it has to do with the amount of tree roots. So if you have more roots and greater density that gets down this far, and there's been a lot of studies with other types of vegetation where they've done dye studies where they put a box full of dye and they pull a tarp out and let the dye infiltrate. And I actually did a study like this in Nicaragua. And most of the dye, especially that gets past like 6-7 inches, at least in my study, and in most other studies I've read, is along roots. Like that's kind of the pathway the water can really infiltrate deep. So as you can imagine, a lot of biomass above ground, so you have a lot of below ground biomass to support that, a lot of roots, and not as many in the inner space. Again, that's kind of our theory what was going on. But to support that, we were thinking, okay, so we have these two different sets of tree pairs, and again at phase 1 area, you have much more sagebrush, so potentially more roots in the inner space compared to this phase 2, where there's less. You can see less sagebrush in the inner space. Assume there's pretty similar amount of biomass and roots under the trees, but in the inner space is a little different. So we thought, okay, with the 15 centimeters, let's compare that. So what we did is we had this metric where we had that change under the tree, so how much did it increase for one event? For that same event, that same tree pair in the inner space, how much did it increase? So you subtract those two. So if you have it above 1, you're seeing a greater increase for that event under the tree. If it's below 1, you're seeing a greater increase in the inner space. And then on top of that, we had we kind of parsed it out. So the biggest parsing out was the precipitation amount. So we did it into tertiles, so into thirds. So this is the lowest third of precip, which is less than 0.1 inches. The middle third, which is still pretty small rain events, and then the highest third, which is all above 0.2 inches. And then we had that low density juniper, high density juniper, low, high. So the takeaway here is for small rain events, not much difference, and probably not much, in general, not much increase for either of them. But for these larger events at 15 centimeters, for the low density juniper, you have a greater increase in the inner space. So again, that's where the inner space has more sagebrush, more roots to push for infiltration to occur. And then for the high juniper, where the inner space has less roots, you have more increase under the juniper. So kind of how we, kind of a conceptual model of this. And again, a way to test this would be to do a dye study. So if anyone has any extra money lying around, want to do a dye study, we can kind of verify this, actually observing it. But kind of what we theorize is going on is that for, so these are kind of two, this is the phase 1 and the phase 2. So for phase 1, you have low density juniper, high number of sagebrush, so more sagebrush and bunch grass roots that can, water can follow that, and so you can have a greater increase in soil moisture here. Whereas higher density juniper, lower number of sagebrush, less roots here in the inner space, so not as much infiltration occurring in the inner space. And again, it's a pretty strong difference between those two. Okay, and then we also want to look at kind of deeper moisture. So we heard these kind of almost stories or myths almost that like somebody was digging a well and it was 100 feet down, they encountered a juniper root. And it's like, really, is that, so we heard these things, and actually to fast forward to, I think a couple years ago, I talked to, who's the ecophysiology guy, the new guy, Dan. And he was on the paper, knew the researcher who they did work with pinyon juniper in Texas, so I think it's the same family of tree species. And there's these karst caverns that they can go underneath. I think they have to even scuba dive maybe and get under there. And they get the DNA of actively transpiring roots under the cave, and they have like a GPS to know how deep they are. And then they get the DNA of above ground, and they can match them. And these, caves are, again, this is different tree species, but these, caves are often like, yes, I don't want to give it a number, but it's, at least 20 meters down. So at least a similar type of tree, they've shown this, with actual, with those measurements. So we didn't have the money to get an excavator, or there wasn't any caves that I knew of in the area, so we wanted to use geophysical methods. So we did a transect across the higher density juniper and lower density juniper. And first we did a vegetation survey. So here's the survey you can see with the aerial photo. So you have more juniper here and then more sagebrush here. The darker color means more sagebrush. And we use ERT, or electrical resistivity tomography. So basically every meter, so about every 3 feet, we had rebar, and then each of them were hooked to an electrode, and the machine would run electricity between each possible pairing of all the different electrodes. So what it does is it shoots an electrical signal, and the other sensor kind of sees how fast it goes. And so there's a lot of things that conduct electricity well. So clay is better than sands, but then the presence of water better than no presence of water. So what we did was we did a wet season measurement, so taken in May. So it's when kind of there's a peak subsurface moisture, so the electrical signal can go pretty fast. And then do another survey in September. So the soil is not going to be different, but the main thing that's going to change is the water content. So there'll be a higher resistivity, so the electrons, the signal will move slower this dry period than the wet period. And so we kind of surmise where water is being extracted from between again, May and September. And so this is kind of more or less the same angle. You can see there's like a lupin species, a lot of grasses, very green, and then obviously very dry in the dry season. Okay, so what we're looking at here is kind of like those ant farms that are kind of the cross section. That's kind of the view we're looking at. So here's elevation. So you can see 0 point, we go up down to 12 meters. And then we have our 100-meter transect. The triangles are trees, and it's approximate height of the tree, and darker color green is closer to the transect. So this is we called it our grandpa juniper, because it's right on the transect. It's a pretty big tree. And then we also work with some folks at Boise State. Travis Walker was a grad student there with, I was blanking on his name. Who's his advisor?
John Bradford?
Yeah, John Bradford helped us out. And Travis was on the paper too. We did a seismic survey. We could kind of estimate where different layers of subsurface, so above the brown line soil, so that would have a lot more water storage. Below the brown line was saprolite, so less water storage than soil, but still some water storage. And this lowest black line was broken up bedrock. So this is kind of based on those seismic velocities. And so the red is basically a resistivity increase. So again, what we assume is what's changing is the water content. So the kind of takeaway here is you can see a lot of increased resistivity here below this large juniper, as well below this group of juniper. And then we think next to this is another large juniper that was just off the transect here. And then compare that to this area we only had a couple of small juniper. And then especially this area where we had our highest density of sagebrush, and I kind of plotted individual sagebrushes that were within a meter of the transect. You can see there's a lot of sagebrush here, not as many juniper. So again, we want to be careful with how we talk about this. So I say juniper potentially extract water up to 12 meters deep, because if we want to really know this is going on, we dig a well here, we take a sample, get the isotopic content, and then get a sample of the tree and see if that matches. So again, another possible grant, if anyone's got grant money, we could do that just to kind of verify. But this kind of strongly suggests to us that juniper potentially extracting water quite deep, up to 12 meters. So. Okay, so kind of bringing these two chapters, these two papers together, kind of basically, juniper is pretty good at using water, basically. So we know that based on those studies looking at increase in soil moisture, that when there's more roots, water is funneled deeper underneath the subsurface in the juniper. We also, that last aspect, look at junipers potentially extracting water at deeper layers. So more infiltration occurs below the tree where there's roots, and then later in the season that tree can extract water at that, at its base. And then in addition to that, the above ground, the piece of when there's snow, they're actually able to kind of preferentially draw in additional snow, which can then melt, and then additional infiltration will occur. So basically, juniper has these strategies of increasing the amount of water it can then use. So it's a good tree for using water. So.
bad tree for using water.
What's that?
It's a bad tree.
So in my John Day talk, one was like, the guy said, oh, I like how you're not being judgmental, but I'm going to be judgmental. And so I'm being a scientist, this is just the data, but he wanted me to be more judgmental in his words. Anyway, so to follow up, I said I was going to come back to this. So when those two stakeholders came up to me and said, take up a lot of water, it doesn't impact stream flow. So for the first one I said, you're right. This was a few years in. It was clear that Juniper intercepted a lot of water. They were using, water in the subsurface. So Juniper clearly have an impact. They use a lot of water. But to that second stakeholder who said there's no evidence that Juniper impacts streamflow, I actually said, and I wasn't just trying to be wishy-washy, I said, actually, you're right at this point in time. There's actually not a lot of strong evidence that Juniper impacts streamflow, and I'm going to tell you why that is. So it's the streamflow paper. So one of the ways hydrologists, we can look at, we like to look at the big picture. And one of the ways we do that is what's called the paired catchment study. Jan Bo called this the Cadillac hydrology study, if you want the high-end study. So you'll have two catchments that are treed, and then you'll measure stream flow 8-10 years, and then you'll cut, if you're looking at how tree cover impacts stream flow, you'll cut down the trees, and then you'll look at the change in stream flow. And you want to do a pre and post regress, so you'll kind of regress the total, if you're looking at total stream flow before, and then after, and see how that regression changes. So that pre-treatment period is really key to have a good kind of tight linear regression. So there has been studies that done on the stream flow issue that looked at does Juniper cover impact stream flow. So first of all, this map is, so each of these points is a data, is a 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer point that I basically took a USGS, US Forest Service land cover map, and I took the Pinyon Juniper points out of that map. There's 40,000 of them across the western US. So each of those points there's 40,000 points is a point where that pixel is Pinyon or Juniper cover of any species. And then I put medial precipitation just to see where it's wetter. You can see, so it's wetter in this parts of Colorado, drier in like central Idaho. So, and then the lettering is where different paired catchment studies have occurred within these species. So the first thing you'll notice, get it to go. Okay, there we go. Is most of these studies that have been done are done in the Southwest or in Texas. And most of these studies, there's a minimal increase in stream flow. So I remember a couple of the Arizona ones, there was an increase of area averaged stream flow after they cut down the Pinyon Juniper species was 5 or 7 millimeters around there. And then within about 5 years, that impact, that change in stream flow recovered. So the vegetation started coming back and that went away. So not really strong evidence for that. There's a couple not similar studies, but sort of studies, but they're not quite as strong as these studies. So basically, there was a paired plot study down in Reynolds Creek that we looked at, where it wasn't Juniper, it was a dense brush, and they had two plots and they cut it down. They just looked at deep drainage, and there was a significant increase there. It was up to, I think, 60 millimeters increase when they cut down that dense brush. There was this one that was done by OSU Extension, Camp Creek. And actually, we had a researcher in the first talk from ARS out of, I think, Burns. Yeah, it was in Burns, he was from Burns. And he kind of schooled me on what this, because I basically, they had the pre-treatment set up. And I actually emailed Tim DeBoot, OSU Extension, that got his data. And that pre-treatment correlation is not good at all. It's like a shotgun blast. So you're like, what's going on? And I think I emailed Tim what was going on. He might have mentioned it. But basically, I remember something with the instrumentation. They used flumes. They didn't really dig down to the bedrock. They just used flumes. I know one year the flume filled up. But I guess what they surmised was happening was there was groundwater that was going underneath that flume. So they weren't capturing all the outflow, because you really want to dig down to the bedrock when you're taking those stream flow measurements. So this study did show that there was more, so that in the catchment where they cut down trees, there was a longer period of time where there was groundwater present. So they did show that, because they were able to show they had some shallow groundwater wells. But the stream flow, you can't really, and this actually was never, I think Carlos Ochoa just published a paper on this work this year, but I don't even think it was looking at stream flow. So there's not a lot of scholarly papers that actually came out of this work. So we can't really hang our hat on this one when we're thinking about this question of Juniper impacting stream flow. And then on top of that, there's 2 ongoing studies that are brand new. So this is South Mountain, the USDA ARS runs that. They have 4 catchments. They've treated 1 of them in 2016, so that data will be ongoing, so it'll be interesting when this comes out. And then ARS folks out of Porter Canyon, some folks linked with University of Reno, and I think similarly they cut one of their watersheds in 2016. So, you know, the data is just coming out, so that'll kind of unpack from an observation perspective how, you know, pinyon and juniper impact stream flow more in this climate. But in the meantime, I want to do this work, and I remember I wanted to do that South Mountain, do like a paired catchment, you know. But basically, like as Mark Seifert said, they kind of looked around and like nobody had money to do the treatment. So I wasn't gonna, you know, wait, you know, like delay my PhD to do it. So we decided for this paper to do a modeling study. And one thing as we talked about this question of, okay, there's no evidence here, but we've heard from like ranchers that anecdotally when that juniper encroachment occurs, you have a spring dry up. You know, the total precip kind of varies across the West. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. But one kind of trend in the climate is the timing of that precip. So this is the monsoon index. So you have July, August, September precip over annual precip. So if you have pretty dark red here, you're having half of your precip or more occurs in these summer monsoons, which is if anyone's lived in New Mexico or Arizona, you know, it's pretty monsoonal here. And then not so much here in Oregon and Idaho, what's, you know, 1% maybe of your precip occurs in the summer. So most of it is occurring in the winter, which is a Mediterranean climate is the term for that. So we want to do a modeling study to compare these juniper cover and, you know, grass cover, so immediately post-treatment, under these different climates, and all 40,000 of those grid cells where we have, you know, potential pinyon juniper across the West. And kind of how to think about this before I talk about the modeling, why this monsoonal aspect is different is, let's say you have precip, let's say we're in a Mediterranean climate. So in the summer, both of these soil profiles are going to be dried out, so you have an empty bucket, and then you have snow occurring, and in the spring it melts, and you fill up that bucket. But during that melt, if you assume the same amount of snow melt, that's going to fill up sooner, and then you get stream flow. So this bucket will take longer to fill up, so that would make sense that you would see more stream flow in this case. But if you have a lot of summer monsoons, you have, let's say it's in, you know, August. These are mostly empty buckets because it's all dried out. And you have a rain event. Maybe it's, you know, just fills up this much here and this much there. All that soil moisture is probably going to get used up before the next rain event occurs. So you can have the bucket kind of constantly being empty. So this is kind of theoretically what we're thinking how this could differ in monsoonal climates versus in Mediterranean climates that we're in here. So we use this model from some Swedish researchers. It's a pretty well-established model, HBV model. Use daily PRISM data from 1981 to 2010, so precip and temp for each of those 40,000 grid cells. And then for analyses, we used averages. So we took the 30-year average stream flow, annual stream flow for juniper and of grass, and we compared those two for each cell. So here is all 40,000 of those cells plotted. So this is the coloration is the change in stream flow between tree and grass cover. So you take green or grass cover and subtract tree cover. So what's the difference between those two? And you can see we have, you know, gray is 0 inches up to purple is 3 inches. And again, that's not total stream flow, it's just the difference between those two covers. And you can see here, basically, the purple areas are much more often in the northern Great Basin, in the northern latitudes where this cover exists, so in Colorado, Utah, and then Idaho and Oregon. And these are just, we grade out the cells that are not statistically different here, so you can see most of the locations where it's statistically different between tree and grass cover is in the northern latitudes. And then just want to zoom in here. Same data, just kind of zoomed in. I want to make a note. I drove down like through Pendleton to John Day, and there's definitely juniper here. So you know, with their, I don't know exactly how they distinguished. Maybe they thought more of this was ponderosa pine. I'm not exactly sure, but there's definitely juniper in this Blue Mountain area. But based on that data set, you know, we didn't have cells there. So, but one thing you'll notice here, there's likely a big increase if you had a change in cover in this model. You know, in the Wahis, here in the Steens, and then parts of these mountains in southeastern Idaho, which I'm not sure which mountains. The Teton? I don't know. Anyway, southeastern Idaho, potentially see an increase. I'll say that. And then just my next section will just talk about access to information. So I basically took each of these points and put them on this cool kind of Google Map interface, and I'll have a link to that. So basically, if you want to know what is this cell here, because that's by my favorite, hot spring or something, I don't know, you can zoom into that in this Google Map interface and click on those dots to see that change in stream flow. So it's to be kind of interactive and people can zoom into spots. And I think there's some better tools out there, to be honest, but this is, I'm not getting, this page of this research is like a hobby, so it's the best I got. And then this final one was just to take home. I'll just tell you what the take home is. It's basically the timing and the amount of precipitation matters. So we plotted, we took a subset of those 40,000 points, and for this data we said, okay, we chose a rooting depth for grass of 1 meter and of juniper of 2 meters. That's kind of arbitrary. It's going to depend on a lot of the factors there at the site. So we said, okay, let's just try changing the storage amount, that bucket size, by 10 millimeters, and we'll do it from 50 centimeters to 250 centimeters, and look at that regression line of change in stream flow. So this coloring, it's 0 is just a flat line. So you increase your bucket size, it doesn't increase or decrease the change, or it doesn't decrease the stream flow. And then if you, it's negative. So if you increase that bucket size, you have a larger bucket, you're decreasing the stream flow up to that regression line is 0.6. So basically the darker spots here are where your change in storage based on rooting depth is going to impact stream flow. So here is the y-axis is monsoon index, so we just standardized it. So 0 is the lowest monsoon index, 1 is the highest, and then same for precip. 0 is their dry site, 1 is your wettest. And the kind of takeaway here is if you have a drier monsoonal climate, not likely to see a change in stream flow based on tree or vegetation cover. But if if we take the 50% precipitation sites, if we go from more monsoonal to more Mediterranean, you see a slow increase in the amount of potential stream flow that's generated. And then obviously this corner here where it's wetter and Mediterranean, most of those sites you do see an increase in stream flow with subsurface cover. So kind of the takeaway here is if you have a site here in Idaho that gets 10 inches of rain versus a site in Arizona that gets 20 inches of precip, you're probably going to have a more of a gain in stream flow with change from pinyon juniper cover to grass cover. But if it's 20 inches and 20 inches, you're probably going to have a greater increase here in the Mediterranean climate. So so the kind of takeaway is both precip, the amount of precip, and climate. The timing of precip matters. Okay, so just brief access, how to access information. So I just developed this website just as a way to make it easily accessible. The idea is if you're thinking, oh, I'm writing up this report, and he talked about that deep moisture, and where is that? And it's like you can just go to this website and say, deep. Okay, you can click on that and kind of summarize it. And I try to use it in more non-technical language, so hopefully it's easily accessible to folks. And this link, which every time I present it, it's like you can't even read it. And actually I talked with Lindsay with the Rangeland Center, we're going to kind of make it public accessible so people can check it out. And then also we have the publications too, so you can look at the abstracts and the link. And I have like a preprint, link to the preprint if you want to look at the individual data and whatnot. And again, I also have, and this link will also, Lindsay will post on the UI Rangeland Center website. This is to that Google map where you can again zoom into different areas and click on the individual points and see the change in stream flow with the cover change. And then finally what I'm asking, and I actually already know the answer based on what the stakeholders said, but I'm curious if there's any interest in an extension document. So, my generation were like, websites, this is cool, it's easy to access, but the older generation might be like, I want something physical to read through. So an extension document is also just kind of a summary for folks on some issues. So they'll have your extension document on, nitrogen fertilization or something. So I could do one on juniper and water if it's useful. Again, this is kind of more a hobby, like I'm not getting paid for this. So I was doing a show of hands, like you're not really stakeholders, so I don't really care either. But actually there was a big interest. Like the folks, there was like 70 people in John Day, or in Burns, and like 2/3 of them raised their hands, same with, so I think I'm going to do this. I might, as an aside, hopefully, Tim, you bring you into this. I might even collab with Carlos Ochoa or someone, just do a joint. It'd be nice to kind of do it together. So I think I am going to do this just for get this information out there. So, okay, then just finally want to acknowledge all the funders that supported the research aspect. So Reynolds Creek Critical Zone Observatory, U of I, the Office of Species Conservation, ARS, NSF, Northwest Climate Science Center, BLM. And then I especially want to thank the folks that funded this research, so like financially paid, are going to pay me to, or paid for the, Airbnb, to pay the travel and the food. So I really want to thank the UI Ranking Center for stepping up with that, as well as the Blue Mountain Forest Partners and the High Desert Partnership, just kind of funding for me to do this and share, get the information out to stakeholders. So with that, thanks. I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you.
I gabbed too loud. I had it down to like tight 45 minutes, and I turned the fact too much. Anyway,
No, it's fine.
so meant to be.
I'm just thinking about the policy implications of this, because so I worked in Texas on junipers, and of course they were paying us money to do research to get rid of junipers because it was going to create more water in aquifers, but based on at least your last analysis, maybe they